Hi, it's Aaron from ETOA, the European Tourism Association, coming to you from Brussels, the capital of Europe, welcoming you to Showcase Outbound North America 2026, ETOA's brand new month-long showcase for everything regarding the outbound North American markets for Europe. We are here to introduce to you what's going to happen throughout the month, including our networking sessions, our insight sessions, our product and destination presentations, and the insights that we'll be sharing throughout everything regarding the outbound markets of Canada, the USA, and Mexico.
For Showcase Outbound North America, we'll be using two different platforms. So I'm just going to take a few moments to describe how the functions work between each. So all the action takes place on the main hub, the attendee meeting hall tool. So you'll see lots of functions on this portal as I'm demonstrating. So across the top, you'll see all the dates. We're still scheduling all of the content that's coming through. But most importantly, you'll click onto each session and you'll be able to join those live on their broadcast date, or if you're watching back, then the recordings will be available for each section. So that is the insight sessions, as well as the product demonstrations and presentations from the different suppliers and destinations that we have on board. So as soon as we have these, they'll be available, but do join on the specified date and time in order to interact with the presenters who will be joining in the background. So before you start using the platform, it's really important, and I'm using our colleague Helen's login here. You want to just go and check your profile information, upload a picture, just check your company description, maybe add any other elements. Automatically, this is set to your browser time zone, but if you want to amend that, please do, and then everything on the timeline will adjust to your local time. Obviously, the meetings that you'll arrange and the different sessions will take place in a single moment in time, but this will just translate it for your local setup. Then you want to check how you want to be presented on the platform, and of course, when it comes to the additional meeting hub connections, that really helps get your visibility out there with regards to how you appear to the other people on the platform. You can select the elements that you want to share live, and then down here you can change your media settings, just in case you want to, your computer may be picking up the wrong camera or the wrong microphone. This is where to come to change those settings. So once that's done, you can update and you're good to go. And that's how the platform works with regards to navigating the different sessions. Additionally, we have the meeting hub. Obviously, it looks a bit quiet here because we haven't launched yet, but everybody who's participating will be here. And this is why I said it's really important to update how it looks like you presented, so with your photo and a bit more description, maybe your full name. Otherwise, it does look a bit cold when we come to it. So I can see my colleague Sophie here has already updated, and you can see how that stands out a bit more with regards to finding people in the list. And their registration type will be listed on here. Also, if you log in throughout the month, you can also toggle online now just to see who's also on the platform outside the scheduled moments. And that's where you can connect with people, request calls, message, have meetings, specific notes, etc., etc. So this is where the month-long networking will take place. That is different from the scheduled meeting sessions for the two sessions that we have planned. Once those meetings are live, they will also be listed on this main feed. But for that, we'll be using a different platform. So as we go into that, this is the second platform we'll be using. We have the two different sessions for the networking. Each time we will launch a quick round of request phases. So in that respect, it is different from our previous online or indeed in-person meetings. This will be where you can go see your available slots, and if you want either one of your complete sessions blocked or specific times blocked, then we can definitely do that for you, but you need to tell us to do that in advance. So at the moment, I'm just looking for the first session, which is March the 10th. This is where you go in and manage your diary and your requests yourself. So we'll just hit the search and you'll be able to see all of the suppliers who are available, details of their company description, etc. That will be loading up and request meetings. So we will do that in around 2 phases, because we don't want people to block up their agenda if those meeting requests are going to be left by their counterpart. We'll be very busy in the background making sure that any outstanding requests are acknowledged, either accepted, of course, that's what we're really hoping for, but if not, then at least cleared as soon as possible in order that then it can be backfilled with another choice. So that's how it's going to work. As we said, it will be just over a week in terms of the requests phased for that. Then they'll be locked in and then displayed on the main portal. And then once that first session's done on the 10th, we'll be relaunching that, maybe with some more buyers and suppliers in there, but a second bite of the apple in order to get those scheduled meetings locked in for the session. So as I said, this is how this platform works. We'll be using that in 2 rounds, and that's purely for the request phase, and then everything else, the live networking, the insight sessions, the destination presentations, the meeting hub. We have the resource gallery here. That's for any of the additional handouts, the recordings of the sessions. They'll all be placed there too. And of course, we've got information from our various sponsors on the banner there as well. Throughout, the most easy way of getting in contact with us, particularly during the live sessions, is using the live support up on the top banner. That's where you really want to be contacting us during the live sessions, because we can see a lot more information about any problems that you're having with regards to the browser and the hardware you're using, in case that's the issue that we're looking at. But it really helps if everybody channels their inquiries through to the live support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aaron. The balance of the presentation today is going to be me, and my name's Tom Jenkins, discussing with our very own statistical guru, David Edwards, and we're going to be looking at the North American outbound market. And rather than me talk anymore, I'm going to hand straight over to David. David, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom, and hello to everybody. So let us begin our statistical journey by looking at trends in outbound departures over the past 3 or so decades from each of the 3 North American markets. There are perhaps no big surprises here in that the largest volume of outbound departures is from the US, then in every year, bar the oddity of 2021, Canada, and then the yellow line is representing outbound from Mexico. But perhaps a more interesting insight than those 3 lines is if we look at what happened in 2024 versus 2019, and 2024 is the most recent full year figures we have. The US, outbound from the US to all departures worldwide, up almost 10% compared with 2019, whereas Canada pretty much back to where it was, but 0.1% up, whereas Mexico outbound volumes still 5% down in 2024 versus 2019. So that's the number of folks going overseas or abroad from those countries. But what about outbound expenditure over the past 3 decades? Well, the 3 lines have a similar pattern to the previous chart, and indeed the ordering is the same. But here, the key insight is perhaps when we look at the spend per outbound departure. We've got the US in the lead at $16.38, followed by Canada, and these are all US dollars, at $13.12, and then Mexico at $6.02. So we can see that there is a higher spend per outbound trip from the US than the other 2 markets. Now let's look at outbound departures from each of these 3 markets that were destined to each of Europe's regions back in 2024. And as we would expect, perhaps from the previous graphics, we've got the highest volume from the US, then Canada, then Mexico. And we can see that Americans definitely get to lots of different parts of Europe. Southern Europe is in the lead with almost, just over 14 million. And then we've got more than 13 million to Western Europe and 11 million or so to Northern Europe. Now you may be saying to yourself, well, which country fits into which of those regions? Don't worry, I'm not going to read all this, but if you look back at these slides, there we've got the allocation of countries to Europe's regions. But let's now look at the proportion of outbound departures destined to each of Europe's regions. So I'll explain this chart. What it's telling us is, for example, if we're looking at Southern Europe, we're saying that of all of outbound travel from the US, 10.1% of trips are destined to Southern Europe, whereas from Canada, it's 7.9%, But look at the Mexico share, 7% of all outbound travel from Mexico is to Southern Europe. And what we can see is that that region, the Southern Europe region, is where Mexico comes closest to the other two markets. Let's switch things around a bit though and think about, well, what's the importance particularly of the US for inbound tourism to Europe? And the US accounts for more than 1 in 3 of all long-haul visitors into Europe. So we really get a scale of how important the US is. What about the distribution of visits to Europe? So this is effectively the same data but being presented in a slightly different way. And so this confirms to us that almost 60% of visits to Europe from Mexico are going to be to one of those Southern European countries. Whereas if we're looking at Canada, we've got 29% going to Western Europe and 42% to Southern Europe. But it's the US where we've perhaps got the most even spread, with just over a quarter to the north, just over 3 in 10 to Western Europe, and a third going to Southern Europe. Of course, Central and Eastern Europe is a relatively smaller market, but it has been somewhat depressed by the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. So that's a lot of historic data, but let's look at what tourism economics have said in terms of the forecasts that they have provided to the European Travel Commission. So this is projected growth in departures to each region from each market over the decade 2019 to 2029. So the good news here is that for all of Europe's regions from each of these 3 markets, growth is projected across that decade. And we can see that, in fact, in relative terms, it's travel from Mexico to Southern Europe that is forecast to grow the swiftest at 63%. But indeed, it's that Southern Europe region that is tending to bring about the strongest forecasts, whereas we've got Western Europe lagging behind somewhat. And we can get from the US very contemporary data. So this is the number of US citizens who get on an airplane somewhere in the United States that is going to land somewhere in Europe. It's based on data from what are called I-92 records provided by the International Trade Administration in the US. What I've done is calculated the rolling 12-month tally, and we can see the pandemic era, and then we can see really continued growth in the years since. And if we look at year-on-year growth, well, that stood at 4.7% in the 12 months to January of this year. So at least at the start of this year, we are continuing to talk about growth in travel from the US to Europe. Clearly, if you're going to have travel, you need people to be traveling. So let's look at a few slides on demographics. We'll begin by the resident population as of 2026 in each of our 3 North American markets. So we've got the US being the most populous of the 3, then Mexico, and then Canada. Now, the US and Canada have experienced population growth in the past 5 years that has been driven primarily by international migration, with, for example, the population of both Texas and Florida having increased by about 2 million over the period just since 2020. So that's looking at how many people there are now, but let's look at UN forecasts for population growth between now and 2031. And each of our 3 markets is set to grow. We've got a projection of more than 8 million extra folks living in America. We've got growth of almost 5 million in Mexico and nearly 1.5 million in Canada. So as we've seen, there's been a lot of growth in the US population, courtesy of international migration, similarly in Canada. Whereas in Mexico, it's much more about natural change. What's that? Well, that's the difference between births and deaths. And it's this slide that helps explain that, because what we're looking at here is the age distribution across the 3 markets. Now, compared to many Western European and Eastern Asian markets, both the US and Canada is a relatively young population. But what we can definitely glean from this chart is just how young the population of Mexico is in relative terms, with pretty much half of those living in Mexico being aged under 30. That's demographics, so we ought to talk about economics. We'll begin with some data from the International Monetary Fund, and this is the estimated and projected growth in GDP for last year, this year, and next year. So we've got the US growing really quite strongly for last year, and if these projections are correct, even more strongly at 2.4% this year. Canada lagging a little bit behind, and certainly last year Mexico having relatively weak growth, but set to improve this year. And then looking at 2027, each of the three markets expect to see economic growth around about 2%. But of course, we need to treat with a little bit of skepticism economic forecasts, especially when there is so much going on both economically and geopolitically around the world. But it matters for tourism, not just whether an economy is growing, but how wealthy people are within that economy. What we're looking at here is what is called GDP per capita, but put in terms of what's called purchasing power parity in international dollars. So we're allowing the fact that it costs more to live in one country than another. But what this is telling us is that those in the US have the highest GDP per capita of the three markets, ahead of Canada, and that Mexico down in third place at about $26,000. These are averages, and now many of you may work in the luxury segment, and so these are stats that are really important because, according to Knight Frank, in 2024, the estimated population with wealth of more than 10 million US dollars stood at more than 900,000 in the US, so a vast top-end market. In Canada, it was 65,000, and in Mexico, 18,000 with wealth of more than 10 million US dollars. So how confident are US consumers feeling? This is the longest time trend that I've got in this set of slides. It's more than half a century's worth of data on consumer confidence in America. And what we can see is that consumers have been feeling a little bit lackluster in recent times. It's picked up in the last month or two, but still in historical terms, they're feeling a little bit dubious. But what we can say is that the US economy hasn't been impacted by the imposition of tariffs on other nations as much as had been feared this time last year. But there are many analysts who do fear the impact of what is being termed an AI bubble bursting. Why so? Well, unlike in Europe, there is really high share ownership in the US, estimated at 62% of Americans own stocks. And if there were to be a dramatic change in the US stock market, there might be many middle-income Americans who start feeling less wealthy because of that. One of the impacts on how much folks spend when they're traveling abroad is what's been happening to the exchange rate. So let's look at the cost of buying either £1 sterling or a euro for those using the US dollar over the past 24 or so years. So if the lines are going downwards, it means it's getting cheaper for Americans, and conversely, if it's going up, it's getting more expensive. So the insight here is that coming to Britain or the rest of the Eurozone is, historically speaking, still quite affordable for Americans compared with 15 or so years ago. However, spot that over on the far right of the chart, those lines are starting to track upwards, meaning it's getting a wee bit more expensive as the US dollar has started to weaken. We can do the same thing for those with the Canadian dollar. Broadly speaking, the picture isn't that similar in the US, but it's perhaps a bit more of a marked increase in how much it is costing Canadians to buy either sterling or euros in the past 18 or so months. I don't have data for the Mexican peso from the same source, so this is just daily data, which is why it wobbles around quite so much, from the ECB going back to 2008. The story here is that for the most part, What it's costing Mexicans to come to Europe at the present time is pretty much the same as it was in the late 2010s. Right, let's talk about connectivity. And I'm going to start this section by looking at the airlines that offered the most seat capacity between the US and Europe during the summer of last year. And what we can see is that the three airlines leading this chart are all domiciled in the US, so United, Delta, and then American, followed by three European domiciled airlines, BA, Lufthansa, and Air France. But overall, total one-way seat capacity between the US and Europe over the April to October period last year reached a rather whopping 33.1 million seats. For Canada, I thought I'd look at it slightly differently, but again using data from OAG. And this is international seat capacity to from Canada in Q1 of this year. So the height of the bars, that's telling us about the volume of seats, with the little figures on the top of each bar, that's telling us about the change compared with Q1 of last year. So most international seat capacity ex-Canada is to the US, but what we can see is that it's projected to be minus 10% compared with a year ago. And if some of the announcements over the last few weeks were added into this chart, probably it's going to be a steep decline still. But we can see we've got additional seat capacity from Canada going into Mexico, but also to European markets, the UK and France, seeing growth in capacity from Canada, whereas we've got Germany seeing a bit of a decline this year. And then it's over towards the right of the chart, so relatively low volumes of seats, ex-Canada. Notice Japan, which has really been growing its inbound market over recent times. And as perhaps folks in Canada think about, well, where can I go that isn't America? It might be Asia as well as Europe that starts to benefit. So there are added costs to those wanting to visit Europe, because visitors from the US, Canada, and indeed Mexico who want to visit the UK need to apply for an ETOA. That'll cost them £16, and before much longer, it will be £20. While the equivalent ETIAS fee for the Schengen area, that is expected to be €20 from its introduction later in 2026. So what drives destination choice? And this is based on research undertaken by Visit Britain 2 or 3 years ago, and folks around the world were asked for, across a whole range of different factors, which of these are important to you when you're choosing a destination for a holiday or a short break. Let's just look at the top 5 for those in the US. And is a welcoming place to visit? Well, almost 3 in 4 said that was extremely important. Ahead of it's easy to get around once I'm there, almost 70%. And then 3 factors pretty much tying on 69%. So it's a place where I explore history and heritage, lots of beautiful countryside and coast to explore, and it offers good value for money. From Canada, it's a little bit different, but not so much so. We've got offers with value for money up at the top, cited by all more than 2/3 as being extremely important. It's a welcoming place to visit, tying there on 67.2%, and then easy to get around once I'm there, beautiful countryside and coastline to explore, and being easy to roam around exploring lots of different types of places. Let's look at some research based on those who visited Britain in 2024, where they were asked as part of the International Passenger Survey when they had booked their trip. So what is this chart telling us? Well, it's telling us that more than 3 in 4 from both Canada and the US booked their trip to Britain less than 6 months in advance. The most common time frame was 3 to 6 months before the trip, with 39% for both the US and Canada. But spot quite a significant proportion of travellers who are booking their trip 2 months or less before travel. There are, of course, a few events in 2026 that could impact outbound travel from the USA. So the US will celebrate its 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence this July, and this may well entice some Americans to take a domestic rather than a foreign vacations trip. And of course, the Men's FIFA World Cup takes place during June and July in Canada, Mexico, but mostly across US cities. And that equally may disrupt some patterns of transatlantic demand and indeed airfares during the peak summer period. That's a lot of stats. Just a little reminder before I hand back to Tom that we've got a whole wealth of insights on a range of topics, all of which are summarized and available on the ETOA Insight Hub. With that, I will say thank you for your attention. I will stop sharing and I'll hand back to Tom.
As ever, this was a inspiring tour of the horizon with lots and lots of data and interesting points. I think the really telling point you were making was about currency at the moment. There are two things in my mind, and I'm here to be corrected. There are two things in my mind that tend to drive fluctuations in visitors from North America to Europe. One is the currency, and I think people seem to remember highs and lows, if that makes sense. They will have spotted when the American hit a record high and will note when they hit a record low. They won't necessarily remember it, but it'll become a benchmark against them. And the thing that concerns me just at the moment is that we are hitting one of the record lows against the euro and the pound at this moment. And the second factor that drives it is, I think you're quite right, the American stock market, because all the people that we are trying to sell vacations to will have savings in the stock market, and that's the money they use on their holiday. They probably won't be paying for their vacation out of their regular income, unless they've got such a huge regular income it's regarded as pocket money. They'll be spending the money they've got stashed in the stock market for precisely the purpose of enjoying themselves abroad. And if it goes up, then they've got lots of money to spend. And if it goes down, they haven't got the money to spend. And I think if you combine that with less money and the money's worth less, then we've got a bit of a headwind. I don't want to exaggerate the subject, but it just means it's much, much more difficult to make a sale in those sort of conditions. Do you agree with that sweeping generalization? I think is my way of putting it.
Your summation, Tom. So I think what I'd say about exchange rate is that there has definitely been a little bit of weakening in the past year or so in the US dollar, but not to the extent that some people feel. And in a sense, some have now been reassured by the decision on who it is that will be the new chair of the Federal Reserve. There are some worries that maybe the Fed would be cutting interest rates more than was sensible, and that would drive down the value of the dollar. That hasn't happened. So markets do seem a little bit reassured that actually US base rates won't fall too quickly. So that may help support the value, the strength of the dollar. So we shouldn't get perhaps too queasy about what might happen to the dollar over the next few months. And then in terms of the point regarding share ownership in the US, absolutely, you're right in terms of how that money and that wealth is used. But I guess layered on top of that is psychology. It's not just how much money have I literally got. It's just, do Americans feel, yes, I am well off. I can afford to go to Italy or to go to somewhere new like Montenegro or wherever it might be. Or are they thinking, crikey, my wealth has plunged by X% over the past few weeks because of what's going on. Therefore, I need to cut back on some of those big ticket expenditures.
I think you're right. I think this is, and given that there is no way we can predict where the exchange rate's going, and we can't predict what the stock market does. If we could predict these things, David, I don't think either of you or I would be sitting here. No, but I think the other really interesting point actually was the Mexico point, and you were pointing out that they represent a really significant proportion of the people of the North American visitors going to Southern Europe. And the obvious point, and I'm surprised you didn't make it, so I'm just floating it, is that Mexican demand for Spain will be really considerable. You know, if,
And
if if people want to go where they feel welcome and can speak the language, it's like a double tick.
absolutely. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg in that if you look at the connectivity from Mexico to Europe, it's definitely Spain that gets the lion's share of connectivity that is going to be a mix of those from Europe going to Mexico and vice versa. Whereas many of the Northern European markets, their connectivity to Mexico, aside from Mexico City, is just to Cancun. And that's about Europeans going there much more so than Mexicans coming to Europe. So there's a relatively weak network from some of the lesser known, in Europe at least, Mexican cities to Europe. So there is untapped potential there, but a lot of pieces have to fall into place, I guess, for airlines to feel confident enough to operate those routes.
Indeed, indeed. You were right to highlight, and it's actually got nothing to do with this conversation, but it's a very interesting point. The extraordinary rise in Japan as a destination internationally. It's one of the great sort of inbound success stories. It's got nothing to do with ETOA, I hasten to add, but it's one of the great phenomena that what was a great origin market has turned into a great destination. And we're seeing demand for Japan boom. We hope this will help the connectivity of Japanese wanting to come to Europe, that there's such huge demand for Japan almost globally. The other interesting statistic about you had with Canada was the obviously the decline in demand for North America, and you were implying that there's more of this to go. Is that the case?
If you look at what airlines have been announcing in terms of their schedules for what is termed Northern Summer of 2026 schedule over the last few weeks, most of the announcements from Canadian Airlines have been reductions in their route frequencies or indeed just their route networks to the US, whereas they are increasing capacity to Mexico, to the Caribbean, to other places. And I suppose one of the things I didn't mention, which is potentially a tailwind rather than a headwind, which is a good term to use when we're talking about connectivity and flying, is the advent of a number of airlines, both in the US and in Canada, having as part of their fleet the Airbus A321XLR. And not wanting to sound too geeky, but this is a single aisle aircraft capable of flying for about 11 hours or 4,700 nautical miles. That means huge swathes of Canada and the US are accessible using a highly efficient, there's about 30% less fuel burn and emissions per seat compared to equivalent aircraft. That is a real opportunity to open up some of those secondary markets. So I think it was Philadelphia to Porto is likely to get American Airlines route from 2027 using this aircraft, because it just makes a whole raft of new route opportunities open up that would not have been financially sustainable using a wide-bodied, high fuel burn aircraft.
I think you're right. I think, as an industry, we tend to ignore, the pinch points in terms of demand and launch points from the origin market. We just assume that people can easily get to New York or easily get to Chicago, and it's not that straightforward. And if you can provide a flight from cities like Philadelphia, which are mighty cities, don't get me wrong, this is a game changer, and I think you're quite right to bring it up. No, that's very good. And the point about Canada is simply that there appears to be a real drop in demand for the USA from Canada at the moment, and we're seeing a concomitant rise in holidays to Europe. It's not an absolute. Obviously, there are plenty of Canadians who don't respond to current political sentiment. Others are actually hardwired into the USA. It's very difficult if you've got a holiday home in Florida where you're hoping to spend the winter, it's very difficult just to ignore it. I think we're seeing a very interesting case of traveller sentiment driving demand, and this is not something we often see. Well, look, David, thank you so much for that. I think this is, as ever, the beginning of a long conversation this month, all about America and Canada and the USA. And we will surely be hearing from you again on this subject. But before then, I just want to thank you very much for taking part, and thank you, audience, for taking part.